Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Hello, I'm Colonie Town Judge Peter Crummey, and welcome to Benchmark. We'll explore a variety of issues involving our legal system, our justice system, and how they intersect with the citizens of the town of Colonie. Today, we are truly fortunate to have as our guest Attorney Neil Murray, who has practiced law in and around Albany County in the Capital Region for 45 years. Neil Murray is a senior partner at O'Connell Aronowitz in downtown Albany and has participated in a variety of cases throughout his 45-year practice, which have had an impact not only on the citizens here in the town of Colonie and in the Capital Region, but throughout the state of New York. Please join me in welcoming Neil Murray.
How are you, Peter? Thank you.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here today. So many times I hear about you on the radio, on the television, and so many citizens have said you've got to have Neil Murray on to talk. And of course, I've reminded them that a 30-minute show could never do justice to you and your years of extensive practice in a variety of high-profile matters. But we're happy to have this chance to have you with us just for a short amount of time. And thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm thrilled you asked me, and it's hard to believe. You said in the introduction 45 years. It seems like yesterday I was graduating from law school, so it's going very fast.
Well, and you continue to do pace setting for the rest of the bar here throughout our area. In so many different ways, and certainly even in a most recent and late-breaking Supreme Court decision that you've had an opportunity to review, and I wanted to ask you some questions about that. As you know, just a week ago, Mccutcheon versus Federal Election Commission was just released. The decision was released by our United States Supreme Court. And it has tremendous implications on politics and on campaign finance. And you have spent a considerable amount of time in that field. And I was wondering if you could explain to us that decision. It's hot off the press. And we could do some follow-up inquiries about what it means for campaigns as we move forward.
Well, Peter, that's a question that I hope all our viewers are interested in, because it's going to profoundly affect the face of politics. It follows closely on the heels of a decision a few years ago by the Supreme Court in a case called Citizens United, which I'm sure many of the viewers are familiar with, which had to do with corporations and whether or not Congress could outright prohibit corporations from contributing to political campaigns and candidates. And this most recent decision goes beyond corporations and talks about whether or not Congress has the authority to limit in certain ways the amount that individual citizens may wish to spend in support of their candidates. And the critics of the decision will say this really subverts and undermines any attempt by Congress to regulate money in politics, because it essentially frees people to spend as much as $5,600 per candidate on as many candidates as they wish to support. So theoretically, they could make contributions to every single member of a particular party running for Congress. And the question is whether or not there's too much money and whether it really has a corrupting influence. And given this decision and the Supreme Court's concern that it will frustrate freedom of speech, does it really undermine the whole political process and corrupt it too much in the name of the First Amendment?
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because it seems to me that the decision, because the current formula for donations, as I understand it at the federal level, there's not only are there caps for total amounts that you can give, but ultimately a total amount of how many people you can give to. And was it that second piece that was the primary concern of the Supreme Court in its recent Mccutcheon decision?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Peter. What happened was that you could contribute as much as I said, $5,200 to a particular candidate, but you couldn't spend more than $45,000 or $46,000 in the aggregate. So in effect, If a candidate wanted to spend more than that, and the plaintiff in this case, Mr. Mccutcheon, in his paper said exactly that, said, I'd like to spend more money on more candidates, but Congress won't let me do that, so they're denying me my right to participate in the political process to the extent that I want to. And why is it that if I give to 9 candidates, what is it about the 10th candidate that I can't give to? It doesn't make any sense. And the Supreme Court essentially bought into that reasoning. But as I said, the critics are saying, wait a minute, not everybody can give $5,200 a year. And the concern is that this will have a disproportionate effect, will affect access to candidates, and will corrupt the process. So is Congress's hands tied? Are the people's hands tied in terms of regulating money in politics because the First Amendment gets in the way of it? And was that really what the First Amendment was meant to protect? Those are the issues.
Do you think do you think Congress may respond by limiting the total amount an individual could give, so no longer limiting the number of people you can give to, but limiting the total amount an individual can give to?
Well, that is a very interesting question. In fact, Justice Roberts, who was the author of the main opinion in the case, and it should be reminded, this was a 5-4 case, like so many other controversial cases. This was 5-4 as well. But Justice Roberts did say there are ways that you can regulate it. You just can't regulate it in this particular fashion. So one theoretical alternative would be to say, well, we'll allow you to give more to more candidates, but we're going to limit the amount that you can give to any one individual candidate, and we're also going to limit the amount that you can give to campaign committees. One of the concerns as well is that when you give money to a campaign committee as opposed to an individual, it's not earmarked for an individual, they can recirculate and redistribute the money back to the candidate. So in effect, you're getting around the ceiling. But Justice Roberts said it's not for us. Congress makes the laws. We only enforce them, and we make sure that they're consistent with the Constitution. If we're going to strike this down, Congress has other ways that they can do it. So it remains to be seen whether Congress will take another swipe at campaign finance reform.
Well, it's hot off the press, and I'm so happy that we've had a chance to address it, because I don't think that the discussion will end as of last week, and there'll be much more focus on that as we move forward.
There is one other thing, Peter, before we leave the subject.
Sure.
I want to talk about the decision a few years ago in Citizens United. One of the main arguments there that was put up was, wait a minute, a corporation's not a person. The First Amendment applies to people. It doesn't apply to a corporation. Supreme Court didn't buy that argument. They said, we're not going to gag corporations entirely and forbid them from speaking out on political issues that may affect them. The Supreme Court, to its credit, is very protective of the First Amendment. And you say, well, does it apply to a corporation? And in some cases, as in this, the Supreme Court said that a corporation took on the persona of an individual human being in some respects. So, and people can say, well, corporations, they don't have the protections of the First Amendment. But if you stop and think about it, do you really want to go so far as to muzzle corporations so they cannot comment on particular things? I think it was an interesting decision. There are a lot of critics. I understand the critics, but the Supreme Court's always in that balancing process.
And weren't there other ways that actually donors or interest groups were working around the original laws put in for campaign financing, certainly at the federal level, and they created political action committees? Didn't those were spawned by the original attempts to curtail campaign finance?
Exactly right. So-called soft money and political action committees, where you don't give to a designated candidate, but you give to somebody else, and they can reroute the money, and it gets back to where it was. Peter, it's a phenomenon that occurs all the time. When a legislature passes a law, people try to figure out a way to get around it legally.
Well, and it continues today. So we'll keep our ear to the ground on how that continues to develop in many different ways as to the campaign financing. There are often times that people will make a call for public financing. Everything should just be publicly financed. And I don't know whether, certainly that wasn't part of the Supreme Court decision, but we hear that routinely about that would solve all ills. And I'm not so sure. I'm sure the jury's still out on that.
Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be very, very difficult how you would craft legislation such that everybody would get exactly the same amount of money. That might go too far in restricting people's ability to participate in the process and give money which they think is important for a particular cause or a candidate.
Right.
But I understand the other side. Believe me, I see both sides of this debate, and there are valid points to be made on both sides. At some point, you have to wonder if too much money is given, is it going to corrupt the process? And when you say public financing, it may work. I don't know. But maybe it's worth a try. Maybe it's worth a try.
Well, it seems based on some of the television shows that I was seeing this past weekend, and as a result of the state budget being signed into place, there's some other items within that budget which have certainly involved our state controller, and apparently he may be the first one to find out if it works or not. I don't know.
I understand that the way this legislation is crafted, the first one that's going to have to be affected by it is indeed the state controller. I don't know if you want to read anything political into that or not.
Right, but there it is. I saw him on TV as well, and he was being interviewed on a show on Sunday, I think, about that. So we'll hear more about that as well as we move forward. You know, Neil, we've been so lucky as a bar here locally to have you as such an active member of the bar in so many ways, going back to certainly 1985 when you were president of the Albany County Bar Association and creating that camaraderie and collegiality between lawyers. And it continues today. And I can tell you as a member of the association now on its board that oftentimes we look back at the influences that you've had and some of the other former presidents have had as well in ensuring that we distinguish ourselves here locally.
Well, I know you're the president now, Peter, and I marvel at the Albany County Bar Association, and I see where it's come since I was president 30 years ago. It is so much more active today. In the old days, it served a very important function. It was one more of collegiality, I think, and just an opportunity for members of the bar to meet each other outside the courtroom, which is very important because civility between lawyers is extremely important, and the Bar Association has historically performed that function. But today, when I look at what the Bar Association does, I'm extremely impressed, favorably impressed, by the continuing legal activity, educating other members of the bar, all of us lending whatever expertise we do in a particular area to our colleagues in the profession. And it's come a long, long way, and it's a great association.
Well, certainly it benefits to your firm that you've been with nearly 45 years, O'Connell Aronowitz, which is one of the historic firms here in Albany, continues to present so many of its efforts on behalf of the county bar. We even had a continuing legal education just last Friday with Mike McDermott, who's affiliated with your office as well, and he's a former guest here on Benchmark as well. But it shows that your firm is constantly giving of itself to others as well, and that's the hallmark of your leadership as a senior partner at that firm. And we're very lucky to have you there. And also your continued ties to Colonie. I've come to know that actually after you graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1969, you became a clerk to Judge Staley, Ellis Staley, in the appellate division here in our department. And of course, he's an icon here, not only in Colonie, but throughout upstate New York in a variety of capacities, living in the town of Colonie as he moved through the judicial ranks. And it's fabulous for me to know that you had an opportunity to first start out as an appellate division clerk, which, by the way, for those of us those watching today, that's a great honor to be a graduate of law school and be a clerk in the appellate division. They only select a few every year, and you to be chosen in that way is certainly an honor. But also to have that touch with Colonie, New York, is a lot of fun for all of us.
Well, I remember very fondly Judge Staley. To me, he was the quintessential jurist, the attributes you look for. He had a good sense of humor. He was very, very intelligent, but he tempered that with a sense of humor and just a humanity about him. And I can honestly say he didn't really give a damn if you were a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. He was just a terrific guy, and he was a good role model for me. I certainly learned a lot from him. One of my favorite memories of Justice Staley, the last week or so that I was working for him before I was going to go out into the profession, I had learned enough, and there was a case before the court, and I had researched it, and we had worked on it, and he let me write a draft opinion, which he reviewed, and I thought that was a great honor. And he was a tremendous jurist, and we need more like Justice Staley.
Well, and hopefully we will continue to enjoy that type of legacy here in our department. Many times I'll put on the radio, I'll put on the TV, and it's you're involved. And some of the most recent discussions over the past few years have been about gambling and gambling on reservations throughout the state. And it's certainly very interesting to our viewers now, because now that a constitutional amendment has been adopted in the state of New York, and it would appear that the capital region may have a casino in its future as well as we move forward. Some of your input and background, first with gambling on reservations and that impact on the state of New York, and now with the opportunity for gambling in other locations throughout the state. And maybe we could start with the initial. It seemed like for years, certainly in the recent past, that casino gambling was really the province of reservations in the state of New York, involving our Native Americans, and now it looks like the exposure can be statewide. How did that work, where they almost had a monopoly at one point in casino gambling?
Well, your history is 100% correct. Our Native American tribes, the Mohawk tribe, the St. Regis Mohawks in upstate New York, the Oneida Indian Nation in central New York, and the Seneca Nation, all Native American tribes, enjoyed a kind of exclusivity because until very, very recently, as you mentioned, our Constitution prohibited the type of casino gambling that the tribes were engaged in. The tribes, however, were able to engage in gambling, notwithstanding the constitutional prohibitions, because on Indian reservations, certain provisions of New York law do not apply. So they were able, under enabling federal legislation, to set up casinos, notwithstanding the fact that it would be otherwise prohibited throughout the rest of the state. So as you're aware, Governor Cuomo's recent initiative that passed in the form of a constitutional amendment eliminated the prohibition and absolute ban on gambling, and now it's open for others besides Native American tribes to engage in gambling. And so the big question now is, who's going to get it? And that's, I think, on everybody's mind right now. And the way the legislation is crafted, it carves out certain protected areas where only the Indians can gamble because they enjoyed exclusivity before. And in order to get their support for this constitutional amendment, the governor essentially struck a deal with them and said, listen, we'll protect you as long as you don't oppose this initiative for the rest of the state. And as a result, the constitutional amendment passed, not without some controversy and not without a lot of controversy about the wording of the proposed amendment, but all that's history now. And the Constitution has been amended. And one of the areas that is a candidate for a casino, one in this area, and we have Saratoga, where they have the existing Racino. We have Amsterdam, Schenectady, the city of Albany, and the city of Rensselaer, all vying for what looks like it's only going to be one license in this area. And one of the interesting aspects of it is that there must be a referendum by the local legislative body to support a casino. And interestingly enough, as everybody knows, the city of Saratoga Springs recently voted not to authorize a full-fledged casino. We'll see whether that landscape changes in the next couple of months. A license, an application fee costs $1 million, and a license, if it's approved, is going to cost $50 million. So we'll see who's going to be able to put up the bucks. Yeah. Interesting criteria as well, Peter. One of them is there needs to be a referendum by the local legislative body approving it, as we discussed. The other one is, what kind of economic impact will it have on the community? In other words, the legislation that authorizes gambling, in addition to the constitutional amendment, was entitled or styled as the Upstate New York Economic Development Act. And gambling was a centerpiece of this economic development. And we'll see cities like Albany, do they need economic development? Does Rensselaer? Does Schenectady? Does Amsterdam? That's another one of the criteria. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, it seems to be a front page on a daily basis in connection with that. And I know that I also read that any applicant must also set forth a plan for how to respond to addiction that can flow from gambling. We all recognize that gambling can become an addiction. And I speak about addiction constantly in connection with the cases that we see here in the Colonie Justice Court. Many of the criminal cases that we see, and we'll do 8,000 a year just in criminal cases, many of them have a component of addiction involved with them. And while we've had some gambling cases as well, nonetheless, oftentimes the addiction is substance related. But I see that they're making an attempt at focusing on efforts by any applicant to suggest how they would deal with addiction. So they must recognize that it can be a problem and what they're supposed to propose, how to respond to it.
Well, if I could be a little cynical, everybody knows that there's a dark side to gambling, and it's a serious one, it's a very sad one. And all you have to do is look at the statistics in jurisdictions and areas where casino gambling has gotten a foothold. I can refer you to Western New York and the United States District Court for the Western District of New York and the spike in bankruptcies and cases of embezzlement. This is a necessary and inevitable byproduct, unfortunately, of authorizing gambling. Now, does that mean that absolutely you shouldn't have gambling because you're going to have that? No. I mean, a lot of people drink it and they don't abuse it. Are we going to go back to prohibition? I think many of the people make the same argument. Listen, you can't have the tail wag the dog, and because there are abuses, that doesn't mean you should you should not allow it. And I think there's validity to those arguments. I'm against it. I think everybody knows I'm against it. I understand the arguments that you have to weigh that against the economic development that it will do for an area. And so there are arguments on both sides. We're going to see how it plays out. And I mean, I'm not a zealot that feels that you have to say absolutely no every time. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's poor public policy. I don't think it's a vehicle for genuine economic development. I don't think it provides the kinds of jobs that you want to see people get. But having said all that, the people have spoken, and this is a democracy, and so we're going to have it. And I just hope that the benefits greatly outweigh the detriments, but I worry about that.
Well, certainly there's some anecdotal information I know flowing from Pennsylvania and some other places that we're talking about some of the experiences that they were seeing and the rise in possibly identifying the addiction and the idea that people can file a self-exclusion, basically saying, make sure to keep me out of there because when I'm in there, the air alone is enough to bring me to ruination. It's
a powerful addiction.
You bet it is.
It's a powerful addiction.
Yeah.
I'm the last one to need to tell you about addiction. I know you see it way too often in your own court,
Yeah.
and you've shared with me some of the tragedies that you see. It's very frustrating, and this is going to be another problem. I think from a purely public policy point of view, and whether you're pro or against gambling per se, you have to ask yourself about the economics going forward. There's now, in the old days, gambling destinations sometimes thrived and did very well. But one of the reasons they thrived and did very well was there was very little competition. Now we're seeing a proliferation of casinos across the landscape and in every jurisdiction. Massachusetts now, Connecticut we know. There's just an article, I think, in this morning's Times-Union, I don't know if you saw it, about Mohegan Sun in Connecticut and how gambling is down there. Right. So in response to that, they're trying to go elsewhere. Everybody's trying to go elsewhere and get a pie can only be so big, and at some point there's a finite amount of gambling that can be sustained, and I wonder if the competition is going to wind up where casinos start to cannibalize each other, and whether or not they're really going to be an engine for economic development or not remains to be seen.
Yeah, well, I could tell that there's quite a impact. I believe their time frame, the governor's time frame, was to have something open by the end of the year. Do you think that looks realistic, or was that not?
Well, I know I'm not totally familiar with the scheduling now, Peter. No. I know that the applications have to be in by the 30th of June, and then there's some decisions that have to be made after that. But I think the governor, if I understand it correctly, would like to see the process expedited as much as possible to get the money flowing sooner rather than later.
Do you think the lottery over it, certainly in New York State, started in the 60s in some degree or another, and has continued today to a variety of different games of chance available all at our local mini-marts and throughout the state? Do you think, and I believe the idea was at the time when it started that possibly it could help fund our education needs in the state of New York. Do you feel that it's had a positive or negative impact, or no position on state lottery gaming over the past 35 years or 40 years?
It's a good question, and I think the experts can disagree on that as well, Peter, but money is fungible. And by that I mean if you raise the money through a lottery, that's less money you have to raise elsewhere. That's a cynical way to look at it. So do revenues from gambling really enhance education, or is it just substituting one bucket of money for another bucket of money? With the additional concern that a lot of the money that goes into the lottery is coming from the poorest people who can't afford it. I mean, when you go to the local corner grocery store, whatever, you take a look at people in line, and some of them you wonder whether or not this is their desperate last hope and they're spending their last dollar. So to me, whether or not the lottery has really been a great benefit, you can talk about the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars it's generated that the taxpayers otherwise don't have to support because it's coming through the lottery. It's all coming from taxpayers, and sometimes it's coming from the lower socioeconomic group that unfortunately can least afford it. Right. So that's another policy issue you have to worry about.
Yeah, well, that's true, and I'm sure that it is under consideration day to day, and in some people's minds, it's certainly you've got to wonder whether and whether it solely funds education anymore or what it really funds. I think maybe it's gotten so large we've kind of lost track exactly what is it doing.
And you raised a good question of whether the casinos are now going to compete with the lottery. So
Well, I just wonder whether the theory is it will generate. I think those people who have never gone to a casino already, because there have been opportunities regionally, if you haven't gone to one and made that special visit already, would you do that now just because one was closer to home? And if you did, would you do it more than once? Probably not.
I don't know. I don't know.
What do you think?
The novelty is certainly an issue. I think that's going to attract some people that may not have already. But for those who regularly patronize casinos, if there is one in Albany now, are they still going to go to Saratoga? That's a question.
Right.
What's that going to do to the existing casino up there? Same arguments apply with Rensselaer, Schenectady, and Amsterdam, who's getting even closer and closer out the thruway to exit 33 to casino in Turning Stone. How many people are no longer going to go to Turning Stone? At what point is there market saturation? That's an economic analysis question, and I'm sure they've done the market studies. But one has to wonder.
You know, Neil, your practice and your capacity allows you to touch on so many hot button issues that involve all citizens, including healthcare issues. Yeah. And among other things, you serve as the chief counsel to the New York State Health Facilities Association, and which certainly has a lot to do with the development and the managing of nursing homes and assisted living facilities, and which of course has even touched my own family. Mom had spent some time in a nursing facility. I was able to bring her home at one point, and oftentimes they go in for rehabilitation into a facility and then return home. But that's always a key issue for people. And what do you see out there in connection with the regulations confronting health facilities throughout the state of New York?
Well, you know, we are a victim. Our whole healthcare delivery system is a victim in a sense of its own success. The Medicare and Medicaid programs came on as major, wonderful social policy initiatives of the Johnson administration in the 1960s. And today, we see the benefits, and we see, unfortunately, ironically, some of the problems. Longevity is not all it's cracked up to be unless you have good health the whole way. The cost of the system is far, far beyond what I think the actuaries originally understood. And people are living longer, and yes, thankfully, a lot of people are living longer with quality in their lives, and drugs have done wonderful things. But in the end, we still have a problem financing our healthcare system. We see what the Affordable Care Act is an attempt, albeit an awkward one, to address the problems in the system. But what worries me is whether or not we can sustain it. The cost of healthcare has recently, in the last couple of years, it has plateaued, ironically enough. But it has gone up dramatically, and it's a function of demographics. So many people are living so much longer, and if we're going to sustain them and try to have as many people as we can have a productive and healthy long life, which looks like a good thing, it's also a problem in terms of where are we going to direct our resources. And I saw a statistic, this is probably about 5 years old now, but it makes you stop and wonder. We spend a huge amount of money on the last 6 months of life in this country. And you look at it and you talk, are we getting the quality bang for our buck versus reinvesting those resources in our youngest kids, and the kids particularly who, because of socioeconomic reasons, may be disadvantaged in getting a good education. And we can't be in the process of saying, well, we're going to take from them to give to them. You can make equally compelling arguments. We owe it to the generation that brought us to where we are now, but we owe it to our kids as well. And balancing that is a very, very tough thing. But the thing that I worry about with healthcare, as I see, is the ability. Government makes so many promises because it's popular to do so. But government only has the ability to sustain it if it's willing to tax its citizens. And the very same citizens that want all the services rebel at the idea that they're going to have to pay for them. And it's really a huge problem. And I see it, I don't see where the solution is right now. But you bring up something else. It has nothing to do with healthcare, but you said you know, you practice in healthcare, you practice in casino. One of the beauties of practicing law in Albany is it's a smaller city, which is nice, but it's a capital city. So there's a lot of action, and there's a lot of very interesting things going on in Albany. So it's a great place to live, and it's a great place to practice law. And it's great to be part of the Albany County Bar Association as well for that reason.
Well, we're all certainly lucky that you continue to be involved in so many important issues and leaving your imprimatur on shaping them as we move forward. We've certainly talked about gambling, we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about campaign finance. Education is something that's near and dear to you in a variety of different ways. I know that, among other things, you currently serve on the board of directors at the Albany Academy, which you graduated from, and also I understand that you might have agreed to become a board member on a charter school as well. It only highlights and underscores your commitment to education. And I think that, how do you see as we move forward with public and private? I believe we certainly need both to excel in order to have a challenging education system that provides opportunities for our young people. How do you see that parallel motion and how it affects education in the future?
I totally agree with your statement that we need a very, very, very strong public education sector, and we need an equally strong private education sector. And I think they can certainly complement each other. I think too often we look at it in terms of competition. Competition is a good thing. And I've grew up, I was a beneficiary of a private education, and I love my alma mater, as everybody else should, wherever they went to school. And I want to see both the private sector and the public sector flourish, and there's certainly room for both. I really am concerned about public education simply because I know we spend an enormous amount of money on it, but I'm not sure we're getting the proverbial bang for the buck. The solution is not just to throw money. It's how we educate, what the curriculum is, and of course right now with this controversy about the Common Core and all the issues that that's raising, I think some of this debate is good and it's healthy. But you know, I sometimes worry about where we're putting our emphasis in education. And for me, I mean, I have been a lifelong sports fan. Love sports. I'm going to watch the NCAA. I know this is going to get on TV later, but tonight's the NCAA final, and I'm going to be glued to the television set. I'm a big fan. But I really wonder about the amount of attention and resources we're pouring into athletics. I think interscholastic competition is a good thing. I don't think we need state championships. I think we carry that crazy way too far. And we've got to worry about not only how we do in on the sports fields, but in the classroom. And there's a lot of things you learn in athletics that you don't learn in the classroom. Sportsmanship, teamwork, ability to get along with others, all very important life learning skills. But you know, going to state championships is just, to me, it's crazy. We're spending way too much on that, in my opinion, and we're not focusing enough on the kid who's a champion in the classroom as well. And I worry about that. And I really think we need to take a hard look at it. And I myself, I'm a hypocrite because listen, when my team's playing the championship, I'm there and I'm rooting for them.
You bet.
But, we need some balance.
Well, and you know, I teach that to my own. I have 5 children, and one of them is a D1 Division I tennis player.
And I had a D1 swimmer in my family.
So that I constantly ask her. Of course, I'm always excited about her telling me about a match she's played in, but I also say, what's going on in the classroom?
Yeah.
All the time, because I know I recognize, and you certainly recognize that there is a life after you put the tennis racket down. You can always enjoy it as an athletic exercise for the rest of your life, but at the same time, it has its place, and there are other things that need to be accomplished as well for the long race.
Yeah, I had a one of my most important people in my life was my high school football coach, Ernie Steck. And he used to chafe at the term high school athletics. He liked to call it physical education. And he was known as a very great coach, but he was very concerned about this craziness with state championships and how it's going too far. So sometimes we lose our perspective.
Well, well, we continue to. I'm sure that the schools, it's hard for them now not to want to participate. I know that private colleges, for instance, have, my own Boston College, found that their success in becoming a national school, which it is today. But when I went there, it was a regional, pretty much day school at the time. I mean, they were still 40% commuter when I started at Boston College. And part of their success certainly was their opportunity. They maintained a D1 football program. They had some successes which helped to get it on television so that students from around the country could see that. And they've recognized that that had a large degree of that exposure that an athletic win or a football game or a hockey game for Boston College, in their hockey successes in the last 15 years have put them in everyone's living room. And all of a sudden, at the same time, applications are now 35,000 for 2,000 spots.
A very valid point. Notre Dame exists today. That's how it raised its profile 75 or 100 years ago. Boston College is a spectacular school. I mean, it's when a kid gets into Boston College today, the family's got to be thrilled because it's a terrific school. And it's a lot more than just a sports school.
Yes, it is. Right. But I know that the business of it was developed in part by recognizing that they put that emphasis in there. And of course, we were told, I was on the varsity swimming team at Boston College, which generated $0 and zero audience. But nonetheless, they would tell us that the football team, even then, which was emerging, would generate $1 million a year, paid for itself and all of us. And all of us.
Yeah, absolutely cross-subsidized the other sports. There's no question about it. So, once again, it's all not black and white.
Oh, I know. Well, I can tell you that we've been so happy to have you here today, Neil. You've been involved in so many issues, statewide and nationally, and can speak eloquently on any one of them, which just reminds us all here in the town of Colonie the positive impact that you've had on the bar and the practice of law here in the capital region and throughout the state of New York. You're an asset and one of our community leaders, and we're so happy to call you our own.
I'm thrilled to be part of this community as well, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Colonie Town Judge Peter Crummey, and thank you for joining me on Benchmark.